Remark further on the resolution proposing an amendment to the state constitution. Senator Sampson, distinguished ranking member of the Committee on Government Administration and Elections.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I agree you look very good standing up there today. I want to start by saying that I'm a little, I wouldn't say disturbed, but concerned about the tone of the introductory comments on the bill before us, because I don't think it is an accurate depiction of where we are. The very first thing I would say about early voting is that it is not true to say that Connecticut does not allow for early voting, because we in fact absolutely have early voting. We have 45 days of no excuse absentee voting in the state, and there have been a number of bills passed throughout the COVID era, and also more recently in this very chamber, that have allowed the definition of sickness and illness to be expanded in ways that may or may not fit with the Constitution, but were ultimately ruled constitutional by our Supreme Court recently. So I don't think that's an accurate statement. And for anyone listening at home, and in particular the press in this state, I want to make something extremely clear, because the way this issue has been covered over the last several years, I believe, is a disservice to the people of Connecticut. This is not a debate over who wants to provide access to voting and who doesn't. The way it's framed constantly by the majority in that way is dishonest, and it's wrong. Because as far as I know, every one of my Republican colleagues and myself are in support of expanding access to voting, and that includes early voting. The thing is that we differ on how it should be done. I believe that if we are going to make a change to our sacred document, the State of Connecticut Constitution, that we need to do it in a detailed, accurate, and informed way. And we need to be honest, completely honest with the voters when we put a question before them about what the change that they will be voting on actually accomplishes. And that is not accomplished, Mr. President, in the resolution that is before us, and I'm going to explain why. Just to repeat, Republicans, and I think it's safe to say that every Republican senator supports early voting as long as we had the proper protocols and protections in place. I also want to point out that many of us have voted in favor of early voting. I voted in favor of early voting with the proper protections, of course, during this year's Government Administration and Elections Committee process. I would also point out that early voting could have happened in 2019. It is not the Republicans that prevented it from going on the ballot in 2019. We voted for early voting. We supported early voting, but we supported it with proper protections, including a specified time frame and a requirement for photo identification. Had the majority party agreed to those items, we would have had a 3/4 vote. It would have been on the ballot already, and we would have early voting in this state. So, Mr. President, I just want to make that clear to anyone listening and the press, to be sure that when you're reporting on this subject in the future, you do not make it an argument about who wants to provide access and who does not, because that is not fair nor accurate. I want to just talk about the issue itself and the concerns I have with the proposal that is before us very briefly. And I don't intend for this to be a lengthy debate by any means. We have had a number of similar debates recently on the subject of voting and access. And the debate always boils down to expanding access and maintaining integrity. And maintaining the integrity of the vote, to me, is the most paramount function that we have in our state government right now. Everyone listening is well aware of the great divide that exists in our nation between people who, rightly or wrongly, believe that there was funny business in the 2020 election, and also those who believe there was funny business in the previous presidential election. There were claims in 2016 about Russian collusion and involvement in altering the outcome of that election that made Donald Trump our president. And in 2020, President Trump himself made a big issue about the election process and said that he believed that lots of things went wrong in various states. I don't know what is true, Mr. President. I've never said that I had any knowledge of any type of stolen election or fraud in any way, shape, or form, even though I have been characterized as saying that many times. What I have said is that it is our job to make sure, number one, that we maintain the integrity of the vote, and number two, that we restore the confidence in our constituents in our voting process. Restoring the confidence in our voting process. We don't have that right now. We have a divided country. We have people that may not accept the results of the next presidential election. We cannot have that, Mr. President. We need to do better. And the way we do better is by working together to develop genuinely positive and thoughtful election policy. That's how we do it. And I want to point out, Mr. President, that almost every election-related bill that we have passed through this chamber in recent years has very sadly come on a party line vote. It is no wonder that people are concerned about whether or not our election policy is legitimate. Election policy should be sacred. We, as members of different political parties, can debate and argue over countless issues. But when it comes to the function of how we are elected, we should find common ground. I mean that so sincerely, Mr. President. We need to work together to pass election law in a way that we all agree so that we can tell our constituents, hey, look, we don't always agree on a lot of stuff. But you know what? We do agree that elections should be, without question, fair, honest, and outside the realm of possibility that the wrong person is going to be seated in an office. And every time we do another bill that is a party line vote with a partisan discussion about the election policy going forward, we have failed. I opened by saying that I think we all would be open to some sort of early voting. Why couldn't we come up with a policy that we worked together on to make that happen? I made my offer. I made my plea in the form of amendments in 2019. I said, here's your early voting bill. You can get support from me and other Republicans if we simply include the proper protections and protocols, and we are honest with the voters about what it really means, what we're voting on. If that had happened, it would have passed. It would have passed by 3/4. It would have already been the law in Connecticut. Unfortunately, there has been very, very little compromise on the subject of early voting or even no excuse absentee voting, which is another subject we are going to discuss in the future. I'll just briefly say that all of those things that are being proposed simultaneously ought to make any person who's watching this discussion and this type of policy wonder about what's really going on. I have to tell you, as the ranking member of the Government Administration and Elections Committee, someone intimately familiar with the law surrounding our election process, I cannot even tell you right now what the law says. It's so confusing. We have passed special rules during the special session. We passed Senate Bill 901, which has not passed in the House yet, which affected the definition of COVID-19 voting. They passed a bill in the House 6205, which changes the definition of sickness. The Secretary of State has issued 3 or 4 memorandums that all say that the illness portion of our Constitution can be interpreted in different ways. We had the Supreme Court of the United States say that illness means any illness by any person. I wondered aloud if that meant someone in Brazil has malaria, someone in Connecticut is eligible for an absentee ballot. I still have not found the answer to that question, Mr. President. And during the debate on Senate Bill 901, in a very polite and friendly debate with my colleague, we couldn't come up with a very detailed answer either, because it is truly and very sadly up in the air. And I'll just say, Mr. President, that is no way to run our state government. We should be in agreement when it comes to what the election policy in this state is, and it should be clear to the voter, something I have been concentrating on many times over the recent months. So let me get to the actual substance of the resolution. The issue I have with the resolution itself is that it doesn't do anything except for say that we're going to change the Constitution to allow for early voting. If I ask someone on the street, what do you think about the state allowing for early voting? They will probably say, well, that's a good idea. But that's not a substantive conversation, because allowing for early voting is not even a policy decision. That is just the start of one. That's like asking somebody if they'd like free lunch, but not telling them that that free lunch is 1,000 miles away in another country, or a food that they don't like. You haven't even begun to explain what you meant by early voting. And that's what the constitutional amendment that is before us does, and why myself and others have concerns with it. It is not clear. And what it does, really, Mr. President, is it takes the power away from the individual citizens who will ultimately be in a position to vote on whether we grant the approval of this amendment to the Constitution, away from them, and gives it to a future legislature. And that I have grave concerns about, Mr. President. I'll just briefly explain for people listening who may not be familiar with this process what I mean. Our state constitution is very clear. We currently are set up in the Constitution to allow for 1 day in-person early voting. This constitutional amendment, if passed, will say that early voting will be allowed essentially by parameters determined by the legislature going forward. That is a much different thing than telling voters, well, we want to change 1 day early voting to 3 days of voting, or 7 days, or 10 days, or 30 days, or 200 days, all of which are possible under this constitutional amendment. The process for which a constitutional amendment passes in Connecticut is that it would have to be brought forth in the legislature in each body, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and presented individually to each body and achieve a 3/4 vote in both chambers, in which case it would be eligible to be placed on the ballot, and if passed by a majority of Connecticut residents, it would become a change to our Constitution. Failing that, and only achieving a plurality of votes and not the 3/4 threshold in either or both chambers, means that two separate subsequent legislatures would have to pass the same resolution by a simple majority. That's what happened in 2019. The House of Representatives, I believe, made their 3/4 threshold on this same resolution. But when it came to the Senate, we had a similar debate that we're having right now. And I brought up the same points that we are discussing right now. And the bill failed to reach the 3/4 threshold. It only reached 50%. And as a result, it has to come back again to a subsequent legislature. 2020, it could not happen because that was the same group. We are in a new legislature now, a new group of people after an election. Many of them the same faces, of course, but some new people too. Right now, what is before us only needs to pass by a simple majority, which I have no doubt it will, Mr. President. But that doesn't change the fact that I believe that this policy, while early voting may be a good policy, the way we're going about it is flawed. And forgive me, I think it's unfortunate because we could have done better and we could have worked together to do it right. What is not specified in the constitutional amendment that is before us, first and foremost, is the length of time. When you say to someone, I'm going to give you a free lunch, that's their very first question. Well, what is it? Is it liver and onions? Or is it a steak? What is it? Free chicken wings? This just says early voting. We don't know whether that means 1 day of early voting, 2 days, 7 days. By the language in this bill, we are taking the power of the citizen away from determining how long that will be. Right now, the Constitution says 1 day. If we put into this language that it's going to be 7 days, then citizens will get to decide whether it's 7 days or not. But we're not doing that, Mr. President. We're saying early voting, which means it can be anything that the majority in this state decides they want it to be. And worse than that, Mr. President, it can change anytime they want. If the majority, and the Democrats are in the majority today, but that may not always be the case, the majority party will have the power to change at will what the terms of elections will look like going forward, because we have taken it out of our Constitution and put it in the hands of the same majority. A very, very dangerous policy. If it makes sense that the party in power has the ability to affect a significantly better ground game over a period of time to recruit volunteers to go out and encourage voting and ballots, they will want a longer period of time. If it makes less sense, they'll shorten it. Which brings me to another point. One of the concerns about early voting is, what is early voting versus a regular election? Theoretically, philosophically, and in practice, these different types of voting are truly different, because a one-day election is a snapshot in time. It says to everyone on the same day, based on what we know up until now, what is your decision? The point I'm trying to make, Mr. President, is that if you expand early voting to 30 days, and some states have as much as 45 days worth of early voting, imagine the things that could change in an election or in the country in 45 days. Imagine that you vote 45 days in advance, and then there's a war. Imagine that there's a scandal about one of the candidates. Imagine that some unexpected bit of information comes your way sometime between the day you voted and the final day of election. I don't believe that's a reason to say no to early voting out of hand, but it is a worthwhile discussion about the impact on people's decision-making for sure. I'd also say that there are countless studies, and I could waste a lot of time by talking about them, Mr. President, but I don't want to do that today. I'm just going to point people to the Heritage Foundation online, because they have compiled a legal memorandum about the costs of early voting. This is an unbelievably well put together document that goes state by state and discusses what happened in each state as far as early voting. And when I say what happened, I mean what happened with the turnout. The arguments we keep hearing about early voting being valuable often have to do with access. But what if I told you that in almost every case, documented very clearly here in this document, that goes without saying, I suppose, documented in this document, it shows that many, many states that have opened up early voting actually have lower turnout than they did when they had one-day elections. So if we are truly trying to get more people to vote, we really should understand the science of how this works. Because when we have one-day elections, there is a lot of focus leading up to Election Day. The campaigns are working on their messaging and their ads and their mailings and everything, all working towards a specific point in time where we'll make a decision on who we're voting for. When you have early voting, especially if it's a lengthy term of early voting, that goes out the window. Campaigns will have to change entirely what they're doing. And I'm afraid a lot of the message that they're trying to get to voters will be lost, because they will have to spread it over such a long period of time. And many people will vote before they ever hear the messages of all of the candidates. And that's unfortunate, Mr. President, because I believe informed voters may be more important than the number of voters. There are a lot of other things besides the time frame that are not settled in the constitutional amendment that is before us. And I could ask a lot of questions of the proponent, and I'm not going to, because we've had this debate many, many times in the past. And I've asked the questions before about what the vision is. If we're going to put early voting in the Constitution, there has to be some idea of what early voting means. Is it 3 days or 7 days or 150 days? I don't know. And with great respect, I've never gotten a clear answer, no matter who I've asked from the proponents of this legislation, what is truly the vision for what it will be. And that concerns me. The longer the early voting period is, though, Mr. President, it's noteworthy the more the cost will be to each citizen as taxpayers. Because when you have early voting, that means you have to have an early voting process, which means that you will have to have polling locations that are open more days, and you will need to staff those polling locations. You will also need to find a solution to very, very significant logistical problems. These things should not be debated, as if they're insignificant. They should not be discarded as unimportant issues. I continually bring them up because they are very important. Right now, when you vote on Election Day, your ballot is run through a machine called a tabulator. And at the end of the election, they print out the tape from that machine, and it says, well, there were so many votes for candidate X, so many for Y, and so on, and we have an answer. What, Mr. President, happens when we have an election that goes over the course of multiple days? One of two things has to happen. Either one, you've got to leave that machine open throughout that entire period of time. Does that mean that someone's going to be watching those machines around the clock in the middle of the night? Think about all of the coverage during the last November election about funny business happening in the middle of the night in whatever state you can name. Whether or not there was funny business or not, you're creating the opportunity for it, and you're creating the appearance of its possibility. Neither thing is good. The alternative is not to leave the machine open. The alternative is to shut down the machine every night, in which case someone somewhere is going to know the results of each day's voting. And do you think those numbers are not going to reach the public, Mr. President? Do you think that people are not going to know where we stand in that election? Do we not think that those numbers reaching the public in the form of the press or otherwise, or being leaked by various operatives in either party, are not going to impact the future voting? Of course they are. I'm not standing here for my health, ladies and gentlemen. I'm standing here because I care about making good public policy. I'm not up here because I just simply oppose whatever the Democrats do because I'm a Republican. I genuinely want to write good laws in this state. And anytime someone comes to me and says, Rob, I want to talk to you about writing a good law for this state, you have my ear. I will listen all day. I will work with you to find whatever compromise we can to make a good law. We did not come up with a good law here. We came up with another vague, overly broad policy that is not fair to the many, many residents of this state who will not know when they answer the question that is on the ballot what they are really voting for. They'll be voting for free lunch, but they won't know what it is. There's more to it, too, Mr. President. It's not just the times. It's not just whether the machine's open or not. There's memory cards stored in these machines that have to be replaced every time the machine is used. Those cost money. They cost money to towns, just like bodies and poll workers will cost money to towns. And what about the chain of custody? Something we talk about a lot when we deal with elections. The chain of custody is at risk the longer you put an election on for, because you have that many more people involved with watching over the process, the machines, the tabulator tapes, and everything else. These are all things that could be worked out. There is no question in my mind. Other states manage early voting successfully, and we could also. But we have done nothing and I mean absolutely nothing in this state to prepare for early voting. We have not done anything to prepare for massive expansions of no excuse absentee voting either, which we'll discuss on another day. We could begin to do those things. And in fact, many of the policies that I've offered in recent years are all about getting us ready for the inevitable changes to come in the future. Mr. President, I would suggest that we need to make 3 changes to this law. One of them is we need to define a time frame. We need to make a time frame that makes sense for people. And I won't say I don't care what that time frame is, because I certainly do care. But I'm open to a lot of different variations on what that time frame could be. But one thing that has been discussed is the idea of simply providing for more convenience for voters. And if that's our cause and purpose behind early voting, then what's the most effective balance for that? And I believe the balance for that is to try and open up a few extra days for voting just before Election Day. Not a broad, expansive period of time, 30, 60, 90 days, but rather a few days. And what I've come up with is similar to a policy that was debated in the House of Representatives a few years ago, which is to suggest that we do our elections in the 3 days preceding Election Day within the 5 days preceding Election Day. The idea being that elections could then be on a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, or a Saturday, Monday, Tuesday, or even a Friday, Monday, Tuesday. And we could even experiment with that to figure out what is most effective to provide access and opportunity for voters in the state. The second most important thing we ought to do if we're going to improve this amendment to the Constitution is we should require something that almost every other state requires, and that is photo identification for voters. That is something that makes perfect sense. I'll just say a quick note about photo identification, which is that almost everybody in the state already has a driver's license. And people that don't have a driver's license often have some other form of identification, whether it be a state-issued photo ID. And we've been through it in this chamber before about how important photo identification is and how unlikely it is that someone would not have it because of all of the things that that you need to have photo ID for, from boarding a plane or opening a check account or cashing a check and on and on and on. So I think that would make sense to make an improvement. And I've even suggested that we could do it in a way that accommodates people by saying, not only would we give you identification, but we would also provide it to folks free of charge if they cannot afford it. And then the final thing I think would be an effective change to this policy would be to change the ballot question, to be more honest about what the actual bill does. Instead of simply saying free lunch, Mr. President, and early voting, what we would be saying is a question that tells the true, complete story. Shall the Constitution of the state be amended to remove what is in the Constitution now, the one-day limitation on in-person voting, to allow the General Assembly to provide for opportunities of early voting without any limitation? That is truly what this amendment does. And we ought to be honest with voters when we draft the question that we will put before them. Instead of simply asking if they want free lunch, we should be telling them what that free lunch actually is. So based on those 3 recommendations, Mr. President, I do have an amendment I would like to offer. It is LCO 9, oh no, excuse me, that's the wrong one. It is LCO 9505. I ask that it be called and that the clerk bring it out and I be allowed to summarize.
Thanks, Senator Sampson. Mr. Clerk, if you would call LCO number 9505, which would be Senate Amendment Schedule A.
LCO number 9505, Senate Schedule A.
Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is a very straightforward amendment that accomplishes the first of the 3 changes I described, which was simply...
Senator Duff.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise for a point of order.
Senator Duff, please proceed with the point of order.
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe this amendment is not properly before the body. While this is an issue of the first impression in this chamber, we find that the guidance and rulings from our House of Representatives. Speaker Abadi in ruling 2-2.1 observed, on the second submission of a constitutional amendment, the General Assembly may only confirm or reject the action taken in the previous Assembly. More recently, Speaker Arasimowicz in ruling on 2-2.2 on a similar issue stated Article 12 of the amendments to the state constitution provides that any proposed amendment that passes both chambers by a majority of both chambers that is less than 3/4 of both chambers shall be continued in the next General Assembly following the intervening election. The Constitution contemplates the exact language being reconsidered in the next elected membership of the legislature, close quote. He continued on to outline the long-standing procedures and the custom of the General Assembly for resolutions that are carried over and noted that the resolution and bill numbers do not carry over from session to session. These rulings also find support in several areas of Masons. Chapter 2, Section 6.2 provides a constitutional provision regulating procedural controls, all other rules of procedure. Section 7.1 provides constitutional provisions prescribing exact or exclusive time or methods for certain acts are mandatory and must be complied with. Finally, Section 12.1 provides a legislative body cannot make a rule that evades or avoids the effect of a rule prescribed by the Constitution governing it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Majority Leader. The chair will entertain debate on the point of order. Senator Sampson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Forgive me that I disagree with the point of order. I believe that this amendment that is before us is a new amendment. It has a new resolution number. It went through the Government Administration and Elections Committee as new policy. It was offered a public hearing. In fact, I offered these same exact amendments, and they were voted on in that committee. I don't believe that we could be here without going through that process. I would also say that what the legislature did in 2019, a completely different legislature, should not bind what we do here. And I don't believe we should be forced to take up the same exact document if we do not wish to. We should still have the power to amend it. And furthermore, I think that we were not even bound to hear this. I don't believe that, based on what I just heard from the point of order and the argument made, that we would have had to take it up. And I doubt sincerely if there was a change in the majority of membership of either chamber that we would have taken up the bill. So I believe that that's just a mistaken view of what happened in the House in the past.
Thank you, Senator Sampson. Will you remark further on the point of order? Senator Kelly, the distinguished Republican leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And before I do comment, I can't help but comment on giving us the opportunity to speak on this before a ruling is issued. I know that we had other procedural issues earlier in the session, and that wasn't afforded to us. So I do appreciate the courtesy that you're giving us to at least make a case before a decision is rendered. My reading of this issue is that Senator Duff was correct, that this is an issue of first impression to this chamber. In all our years, we haven't had this issue come before us, and so there are no rules. That there is House rules, but that's for the House chamber, not for the Senate chamber. And while Mason's rules were quoted, there is no constitutional procedure that would require us to follow the acts of a prior legislature. So we are free to deal with this resolution in any manner that we choose. We have great latitude here. As this is an issue of first impression, we need to be mindful of what the impact is going forward. I think the points that Senator Sampson raised, in the Constitution right now, we have one day, one vote, in-person voting. The resolution doesn't have that same type of provision. I believe that he ran the amendments at committee. He brought these issues forward. I think they're very important issues, and just because something passed in 2019 or any prior year doesn't mean that we are bound to have to follow what the prior legislature did. We do have the authority, we do have the responsibility to look at each resolution that comes before us. And because of that, I think it's within reason, it's within bounds to be able to act on these amendments and to have the conversation and dialogue to make sure that what this body is doing is the right policy for the entire state of Connecticut. So for those reasons, I would hope that the President sides with our case and let us proceed with our amendments. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. Will you remark further on the point of order? Mark further point of order? If not, the chamber will stand at ease while the ruling is prepared. The Senate will come to order. Chair is prepared to rule. First of all, the issue is whether or not a proposed constitutional amendment, which has been passed in a previous General Assembly by a majority, but not a three-quarters majority, on its second presentation to the next General Assembly can be amended. The chair finds persuasive the ruling of Speaker Abate in the House of Representatives, and as was pointed out by the majority leader, there is no precisely on-point Senate precedent, but Speaker Abate, I believe in 1981, observed on the second submission of a constitutional amendment, the General Assembly may only confirm or reject the action taken in the previous assembly. And ruling along the same lines, more recently, Speaker Arasimowicz on the same issue said, the Constitution contemplates the exact language being reconsidered in the next elected membership of the legislature. Again, also there are support for this approach in Masons, and again, we do follow Masons when there is not precise language in our own rules. Section 32 of the Senate Rules provides that the rules of parliamentary practice comprised in the 2010 edition of Mason's Manual of Legislative Procedure shall govern the Senate whenever applicable and whenever they are not inconsistent with the standing rules and orders of the Senate or the joint rules of the Senate and the House of Representatives. So accordingly, there were three sections of Masons that were cited. Chapter 2, Section 6, subsection 2 provides a constitutional provision regulating procedure controls all other rules of procedure. And I believe the constitutional provision that provides that upon submission of a proposed constitutional amendment that is adopted by a majority of the General Assembly is carried forward to the next General Assembly, that is a regulation of procedure and therefore controls all other rules of procedure. In addition, Section 7, subsection 1 provides constitutional provisions prescribing exact or exclusive time or methods for certain acts are mandatory and must be complied with. And again, there is a mandatory carryover period that a question that is presented and adopted by a simple majority must be carried over to the next General Assembly, which has the decision to either take that item up again or not. And finally, Section 12, subsection 1 provides a legislative body cannot make a rule that evades or avoids the effect of a rule prescribed by the Constitution governing it. And I think the offering of an amendment to a previously passed but not yet overall adopted constitutional amendment would create that opportunity to evade or avoid the effect of a rule prescribed by the Constitution governing it. And it could happen in this case. Otherwise, were the opportunity to amend a previously adopted amendment presented to the General Assembly for a second time, the scenario, which I think is an untenable one, could arise that if an amendment were adopted, that would create a new proposal, which could then, if adopted by less than 3/4 vote, would then have to be carried over to the next General Assembly after that. And the same thing could happen again. There could then be another amendment that could be offered at that time. So you could have potentially an infinite series of proposed constitutional amendments that keep getting amended. So the General Assembly could be voting yes over and over and over without the question ever getting to the voters for their consideration. And that, I think, is the kind of untenable provision that is not contemplated under the Constitution or rules. And I think that is why the reasoning of the House speakers in construing that section of the Constitution and the feasibility of offering an amendment to a previously adopted provision being presented for the second time should not be allowed. Therefore, the chair rules that the point of order is well taken and the amendment is not before this chamber. Senator Kelly.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to appeal the ruling.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. Senator Kelly has appealed the ruling of the chair. The clerk will call the roll on an appeal of the ruling of the chair. Let's present the posture of the voting on this. A vote of yes would be to overturn the ruling of the chair and would, in effect, support the appeal. And a vote of no would sustain the ruling of the chair. Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Mr. Clerk?
Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate. Immediate roll call vote has been ordered in the Senate.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Mr. Clerk, if you will please close the machine, and we will announce the tally on the appeal of the ruling of the chair.
Appeal the ruling of the chair. Total number voting 35. Total voting yay 12. Total voting nay 23. Absent not voting 1.
The appeal fails, and the amendment is not before the body. Will you remark further